he was quite a ferocious personality. I mean, all the heads of the record companies were pretty big personalities, but he was the most feared man in the industry because CBS was the biggest record company at the time, and Yetnikoff just ruled. I just had a massive ego. um, so him and Tom Scholz were kind of like yeah,
Yep.
one of these things. So.
T-Bone is on the other side. T-Bone is on the other side. T-Bone, Prime Cuts, podcast on the other side. T-Bone, Prime Cuts, podcast on the other side.
Welcome to T-Bone's Prime Cuts, episode 13. Today's guest is Brendan Borrell. Brendan's essays and investigations have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Esquire, National Geographic, and Rolling Stone. Borrell earned a PhD in biology from UC Berkeley before turning to journalism full-time. Brendan is the author of The First Shots, the inside account of Operation Warp Speed, that People magazine called a stunning look at politics, greed, ego, and scientific brilliance. His most recent work, and the book we're going to cover today, Power Soak, Invention, Obsession, and the Pursuit of the Perfect Sound. It tells the true story of Tom Scholz, the MIT-trained engineer who built Boston's sound in his basement and then spent years locked in a fight to control it. Power Soak reveals the full inside story of this battle for the first time. Welcome to T-Bone's Prime Cuts. Today's guest is Brendan Borrell, the author of this great book, Power Soak, Invention, Obsession, and the Pursuit of the Perfect Sound. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. It's a great book. Now, you've had quite a colorful career as a writer, many various subjects. What caused you to choose this one?
No, that's a really good question. I think unlike people might have expected, I'm not a music writer. I'm not a huge classic rock fan. I like it, I
Yeah.
enjoy it, but I hadn't really thought about it. I think as a writer, I've been writing for 20 years. A lot of my work's like science, but I've also written about crime, and I was trying to like grow and like learn something new every time I work on a project. And it was a couple of years ago that a friend of mine had heard some of this backstory of this lawsuit with this band Boston. More than a feeling was how he explained it to me because it wasn't top of mind.
Hmm.
Um, and I started to sort of picture it and see this like incredibly cinematic story with these characters that I was unfamiliar with. And I was like, yeah, I think I want to dig into that. And it was just so much fun to like learn about this new world. And that's really why I did it.
Without going into too much detail, based on what you know now, what do you think is the real story of the band Boston?
The real story. That's a tough one because everybody has a different take on what the real story is. Is it about this, you know, genius engineer who created the band in his basement? Is it about all of the other band members who were, potentially mistreated or not given their full credit? Is it about the record label helping produce one of the greatest albums of the late 70s? And I think for me, it's like it was a window into how the music industry worked and about this sort of enduring struggle between sort of creativity and commercial needs.
I enjoyed the brief yet very descriptive way that you talked about the basement studio, the dungeon, and how you gave backstories on some of the characters. And we're introduced to Paul Ahern, Don Engel, Walter Yetnikoff, and various members of the band. I think it was genius on your part to include a cast of characters because I don't see that in a lot of books. But early on, I had to keep going back, maybe in the first chapter, so I had to keep going back to see which guys, because it would say Walter or Yetnikoff or Paul or whatever, and I would have to see, wait, is this one the manager is? After a while, you get it, but that helped a lot. What caused you, and this isn't a question about Boston, but what caused you to include that in the book? Because I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah, I've seen it in a few kind of complicated business books. This was for me, it was on the borderline of the number of characters you could understand. I mean, when I started working on this, it took me a while just to remember the
Yeah,
names of the band members.
yeah.
And I used it, my previous book was about the COVID-19 vaccine race. There were all these, players in politics and in business and in science and to keep them straight, I created that cast of characters and I was just started working on this and I was like, yeah, let's do it here. There aren't that many, but it will be helpful. And I'm glad to hear it helped you out.
Absolutely. Now, Tom's father thought he was wasting his time with music. And then, after Tom graduated from MIT, he took a job at Polaroid in nearby Cambridge, Massachusetts. How did how did he keep the dream alive to be a musician with all that was going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Tom's story is, he was always a man divided, he loved making music and he liked the technical challenge of it, but he was also like this creator and this inventor. And so, he was using those two sides of his brain in the beginning, it felt like engineering was the practical route, right? He went to MIT. He, worked on these challenges, including making a device that would help his father,
Mhm.
his father's company, move and situate these pre-manufactured homes that he worked on. But eventually, Tom started to go his own way, and as he's going through college, he picked up guitar. He met Barry Goudreau, who would become the guitarist of Boston. He played in a bunch of bands, and then it was kind of in the early 70s when he graduated and he was like, you know what, I'm really gonna give it a go and try to sell, send a demo out to record companies and try to make it I believe in my music. And I mean, that was the 5 year struggle to actually sell the first album and how he kept the dream alive, determination. I don't know. I don't know much else beyond that. I mean, it was a lot of rejection. And I actually have, a copy of like one of the last rejections he received, which was
Oh,
from CBS Records in 1975. A demo that included several of the songs that ended up on the first album. And I mean, it's essentially like a form rejection. Like, we don't need you at this time. A year later, they get the deal. So yeah, it's kind of interesting.
now, by this point, the first record was released, and at the time, it was the top-selling, debut album in history. Now, CBS, the management, and even the band had to be surprised at this. They couldn't believe this happened. I imagine, could they?
No, nobody expected it. I mean, they had they'd kind of come out of nowhere. It was sort of this lull in the music industry. There was sort of a bit of a changing of the guard, and they thought it was a good album. But I mean, I have quotes from Walter Yetnikoff, president of CBS Records, who he didn't even, he hadn't even heard the band's name when the first album came out. It wasn't until he starts to get the accounting and he starts to see, whoa, this band's really taken off, that he took note of them. But yeah, I mean, that's the way it was, and I don't think that's unusual. You don't know you're signing up a superstar. Especially back then. I mean, now with social media, I don't know, you sign somebody who's got a few million followers. But yeah, back then it was like you have to sign up a lot of bands to guarantee a hit. And I think that's kind of the music industry's argument, which is they invest a lot in failures And so therefore they need to be rewarded generously with the successes. Yeah.
So after a while, and this was after they get their own private plane and everything. And matter of fact, they were on the plane when Tom scribbled out the one-page document that all five members would be democracy and that they would share the, split the royalties equally. Uh, you know, he just thought he was making people happy. Now he takes a lot of heat at times, for being self-centered, but he really did try to please people, at least early on, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Tom was generous with his money
Yeah.
and with his deals, and perhaps too generous in some respects. He didn't know better a lot of times when he was signing these contracts, and but it also the money wasn't what it was about. It was about his art, it was about his music, and that's where sort of, his ego shows up, where he wants all the credit all the time, and he was not very generous with that. And I think that's where you can get, it was hurtful to some of the other musicians in the band. He may have downplayed some of their contributions. And some of them may have, overplayed what their contributions were or how critical they were. I mean, the fact was he was the songwriter, and he had this idea in his head about how the music should be played. So he played most of the notes on most of the albums. Whether or not he had to, I don't know. That probably wasn't great for um, the tying the band together and holding them together. But when you look at his recording method and just how incredibly frustrating it would be, I wouldn't have wanted been the guy called in the studio to play something 1,000 times and get it
Yeah.
right while he's like sitting there getting frustrated. Let the guy do it
Yeah.
himself. That's just the way he worked. And like he's a person and he's got some quirks, and that's just the story. And I mean, I find it interesting, like, and it can be sad, but it's the way that he had to work to produce the music.
You can help support this podcast by visiting tbpcpodcast.com/store and selecting an iconic T-Bones Prime Cuts mug. That website again is tbpcpodcast.com/store.
After the album Don't Look Back was released, things that's when things really started to go south. Now, of course, the album was very successful in its own right. This seemed like when Schultz really started feeling the pressure, and he felt that their manager had pushed him to release the album before it was ready. Can you give us a little of the background there?
Yeah, I mean, so the first album was this enormous success, and there's with every band they've signed up not just to release the first album, but multiple albums afterwards at a certain pace. And in Boston's case, they were supposed to release, um, I'm kind of blanking now, but it was about 8 albums over 5 years, so
I think
more
that's
than
what it
an
was.
album a year.
Hmm.
And and that might work for some artists, but not for Tom, who had spent the previous 5 years getting every song on that first album perfect. And so, he had a few songs ready to go, and that the record company was pressuring him to get going on Don't Look Back. Um, and this is kind of the moment when like your manager is supposed to stick up for you, and um, Paul Ahern didn't evidently. He actually was eager to get that second album out too. And I mean, this is kind of where I talked about this push and pull between commerce and art,
Yeah.
which is like, yeah, you kind of do, it is a good idea to strike while the iron's hot. The first album's out, people are expecting the second one, and you know, Tom had to make a decision, like, do I release one early? Do I, or should I wait? And in this case, he felt eternally like he regretted it. Like he only had half an album, and there were a lot of things he was not happy with afterwards. Not even like sort of the quality of the plates. He felt like the final mastering
Oh yeah.
process didn't satisfy him, and he actually like called up one of the employees at CBS Records and was like, "You got to get rid of all the, throw away all the albums. We got to re-stamp them." And they ultimately did update that, but they didn't throw anything away. But yeah, that really soured him on his manager initially, because I mean, it was like the record company, there was the pressure there. He knew what the deal was, but now he realized he doesn't have an ally, and then gradually, I mean, we mentioned Paul Ahern, it starts to dawn on Tom just how much money Paul is also getting from this whole deal. Yeah.
That's what I was going to touch on next. I've worked for some major acts and some lesser known acts, and had a few discussions about recording contracts. Yeah, but reading some of the details of the contract that he signed is just mind blowing. What were some of the terms? And you mentioned that there were writers that were buried in there. What were some of those?
Yeah, so I mean, Tom's contract was pretty unusual, is my understanding. The way it all worked out, it wasn't like completely unprecedented, but it was up there. And part of the deal was, I mean, I just got to give, this is a little bit boring here, but you can't imagine how many times I had to like write and rewrite that whole section to just kind of make it flow fast, but also give
Yeah,
some people, some a course in record company accounting. Um, but uh, but yeah, I mean, typically a manager is basically this intermediary between the record company and the artist, and he helps sort of negotiate the contract you're signing with the record company, and then he takes a flat percentage, like 15, maybe 20% of your
hmm,
cut. Um, and uh, what was unusual in Tom's case was Tom had a separate recording and songwriting contract with Paula Hearn, like directly with him. And then Paula Hearn signed the contract with the record company. Um, and so what ends up happening is you look through this thicket of contracts, and Ahern wasn't really just getting 15%. When you add it all up, he was effectively getting almost half of all of Tom's earnings, Tom and the band's earnings. And you mentioned this writer. This is a little bit complicated to explain, but essentially there were like multiple sort of, there was the original contract that the record company signed, and then there was sort of this addendum that was put on it, and then it was like buried in there where there were these like obscure changes, and I read a testimony from somebody who was really familiar with the record industry, who was just basically said, I've never seen anything like this before. The only reason you would put this writer in this place is if you were trying to hide it from people.
yeah,
And Tom wasn't even paying attention, but what this writer we talk about does is, essentially the record company was going to take a certain percentage, and I'm forgetting the exact number now. And according to Ahern's contract, Ahern had a certain percentage he was supposed to give to Tom. But this writer sort of changed how much the record company was giving, which effectively reduced how much Ahern had to give to Tom. It was pretty complicated. You got to read the book for it. But yeah, when all of this starts coming out, and that wasn't the only thing. Like the songwriting contract, it was pretty unusual for your manager to also be like the publisher of your music. There were other bands where that did occur, but it's basically like it gives them a chance to double dip and have a lot of control. And so Tom was really locked down by all these contracts, and when he started to have a personality conflict with Ahern, felt like he wasn't looking after his best
yeah.
interests. You can imagine when the financial stuff suddenly comes out in the open, it's like, wow. And so that explained a lot of that animosity.
Could you tell us a little bit about the album Barry Goudreau and some of the other band members recorded while, as you put it, Schultz was running the clock on Ahern, and more importantly, the aftermath?
Yeah, I mean, so what was going on is right. So let's think about this timeline here. 1976, the Boston debut comes out. Then we have Don't Look Back in 78. And then the band sort of comes back from this European tour. And this is around the time, Tom and Paula Hearn are no longer talking to each other. Tom's getting just generally frustrated with the record industry. He was a straight edge guy. He was tired of, he wasn't into all the excesses.
Right,
He was just a simple man. Um, and that he's still under this record contract to produce another album, but under his contract with the manager Ahern was still going to get a chunk of that, and Tom did not want that to happen. He wanted to kind of minimize it. He wanted to try to renegotiate that, and so he was kind of running the clock. And there was this meeting in 1980 where he called all the band members over to his house and he said, "Hey, listen, I'm not gonna be working on the album for a while. He was gonna be fixing up his studio. He was gonna be trying to sort things out with Hearn, and he told everybody, "Hey, if you want to do a solo project, go for it." Um, and the person who jumped at this was Barry Goudreau. Goudreau's the guy who taught Tom, how to play guitar. He taught him
right.
some of the tricks. And he was kind of the guy who was also, he loved to be on stage. He loved performing. He was kind of like a showboat. Um, and according to testimony I read, you know, Barry had never written songs before himself. So he wasn't, this was kind of new to him, and he actually took a couple songs to Tom, trying to get them on the Boston album, but Tom had rejected them. And he basically Barry was going to go, decided he was going to go and produce a solo album. And Paul Ahern, the manager, put this together. He went back to CBS Records, or the Epic label there, same as Boston's label. And they started putting together a package, which not only included Barry, but it was also going to include Sib Hashian, the drummer. And then they were going to get Brad Delp to sing. And the only person who declined was the bassist, Fran. Um, but they got another bassist who also was named Fran. So, or uh, yeah, and so they and Tom didn't know about this. I mean, that was the thing. He thought Barry was doing this solo album, and then suddenly he's trying to get Sib to come in and just like do a little bit of playing around on the drums, fix up his recording setup. And Sib's like, "Oh, sorry, man. I'm gonna be going out to LA to record on Barry's album." And Tom's like, "What? You're recording on that album?" And he gradually puts together that it's basically the entire band except for him. Even the producer, John Boylan, was going to be working on the album. And this was just too much for Tom and his, sense of self, his sense of the Boston sound and his ownership of it. And he got really upset, at Barry, at the record company for going along with this. Um, and and it was kind of like just you know just when he was sort of trying to make peace with it, he Barry's album is about to come out, and there was this ad that ran. I saw a copy of it in like the LA Weekly. I know there were radio ads,
Right.
which was basically like 12 million people have heard the sound of this guitar, and it was Barry.
Yeah.
And Tom was like, "What? Barry barely even played on the first Boston album." And it was just like another blow. And I think for Barry, Barry had always been in Tom's shadow. And, he just wanted to kind of like make a name for himself as well. And so it was really hurtful to him. And things eventually blew up, basically that following spring, where Tom evidently was still saying some pretty angry, had some pretty angry feelings, and Barry announced that he was quitting. Um, and this led to this huge division with the band because you may know that Barry and Brad Delp were now brothers-in-law
Yeah.
because they'd married a pair of sisters who had happened to be the flight attendants on the band's plane. And so Brad, who was like less confrontational, kind of just walked out of that meeting too and wasn't willing to commit to the band. So here we are in 1980, and the band is basically falling apart.
Supporting TBPC podcast gives you interesting inside views from the talk space where music and musicians matter. Go to tbpcpodcast.com and click the PayPal button. All contributions are much appreciated.
If you could talk just a little bit about Mark Dixon.
Yeah, Mark Dixon. This was this little footnote that I found in when I was working on this project, which was yeah, the band is falling apart. Brad Delp is not committing. Um, And Brad said maybe I'll continue recording on the next album, but I'm not sure if I want to tour. Um, and Tom ends up uh, uh, putting an ad in the back of Rolling Stone magazine. Back in those days, there used to be like classified ads.
Right.
Um, and it said wanted, rock singer wanted. And he basically put out this call to canvass the country and try to find somebody who had a voice just like Brad Delp's. And one person who responded to the ad was the singer of a cover band in Niagara Falls, New York. And Tom ends up flying this guy, Mark Dixon, out to record a couple songs in his basement studio. He took one of them to CBS Records, um, to Walter Yetnikoff, who was the president, who we haven't really talked too much about yet. But now, Walter Yetnikoff did not know, who Boston was when their album was released. But now he's like desperate for them to release the third album because the label's finances are in the dumps. It's a economic crisis, and Tom brings this new recording he'd made to reassure Yetnikoff because Yetnikoff knew there was problems with Brad Delp, and that was going to be critical because, whereas Tom was kind of this, he's the band leader, but he was kind of cold. He didn't have the charm that Brad Delp had. Delp was like, the people came out, person people came out to see. The lead vocalist, and he was there signing, t-shirts and whatever. Well, he needed a replacement, and Tom had this copy of a song where he alternated between Delp's voice and Dixon's voice, and both he and Yetnikoff agreed that you couldn't tell the difference, and so he had like his backup plan. Um, Ultimately, Brad does come back to the band, and Dixon is let go, which was absolutely crushing to Dixon. But uh, but yeah, that's the way it goes.
You didn't take up too much time on this in the book, but you have a great video about it on your YouTube channel, and I'll link to that in the show notes. Uh,
Thanks. Yeah.
Next up was the Third Stage album. Already late by this time in the story. This is when it started to really get ugly between Scholz and CBS. CBS even started what you call the freeze. You explain that to us.
Yeah, so I mean, we talked a little bit about the fallout with the manager, and essentially
Mhm.
by the early 1980s, the manager is out of the picture, and part of that is because of the Walter Yetnikoff's power as the president. He was able to sort of put his thumb on the scale in that dispute, and so now it's Tom and Walter Yetnikoff who are actually, they have a decent relationship in the beginning, but as Tom keeps, missing his self-imposed deadlines to deliver this album, it's like we go from like, a 3-year gap to a 4-year gap. It's like 1981, 1982. Um, the label makes a decision to cut off royalties to the band. And, this was, you know, pretty devastating to several of the band members who
Yeah.
didn't have any other income. Tom had a few more income streams. He was worried about money, but it really just like, that absolutely was going to destroy the band. And the label's view was that this would put the pressure on Tom to deliver. But they didn't know who they were
Mhm.
dealing with. This is Tom Scholz. He's going to dig his feet in and fight this with everything he has because didn't want to deliver an album until he was good and ready.
Personally, I didn't know, and I imagine a lot of readers didn't know or don't know how big a personality and how big of a just a figure in the record industry that Yetnikoff was.
He was really something. Yeah. I mean, he was this loud Brooklyn-born Jew. He was a lawyer by training. And I read, in he's got a memoir called Howling at the Moon, which is pretty hilarious, and kind of dark. But I mean, he talks about, growing up, getting beat up by his father, and how he, paid his way through Columbia Law School by, running errands and working as a trash man and all kinds of things. So I mean, he was like kind of like a tough brawler. And he gets to CBS. I think it was in the 60s. I'm blanking here, but um, and pretty soon he starts rising up the totem pole and becomes the president. And his personality kind of changes because he used to be, he was like a tough lawyer, but he was also pretty buttoned up. But once he starts like hanging out with musicians, he becomes, like a coke fiend, and he's drinking all the time. He doesn't, starts his day with a screwdriver. Um, and he's like hanging out with Mick Jagger, and I mean, and he was quite a ferocious personality. I mean, all the heads of the record companies were pretty big personalities, but he was the most feared man in the industry because CBS was the biggest record company at the time, and Yetnikoff just ruled. I just had a massive ego. Him and Tom Scholz were kind of like yeah,
Yep.
one of these things. So yeah.
Now, this was when Scholl hired a new lawyer, Don Engel. He had quite a history of getting people out of their contracts. Now, can you give us some of the background on that and just a little bit, because I definitely want people to read the book of the lead up to the $20 million lawsuit between CBS and Boston.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean Don Ingle was this other personality that, I think it would have been lost to history to some extent. But I mean, talking about big egos, you've got Yetnikoff, the record executive, you've
Yeah.
got Tom, the songwriter, and then Don Ingle was, quite an ego himself. And when
Yep.
Tom and Don met up, we like if I've often thought like without Don, I don't know that Tom would have gone as hard, but Don was convinced that basically these record industry contracts were like enslavement. I told you like the record labels, put Tom down for like 8 albums over 5 years. And this is, maybe not every contract was quite like that, but what they regularly did was like they would say, "Hey, oh, you didn't turn in your second album on time. We'll just extend your contract by another 8 months. We'll extend it by another year."
Yeah.
Um, and so somebody is effectively can be under contract for like a decade. And in California, there was a law that said you couldn't have a contract that lasted more than 7 years. And Don saw this as a way to, attack this power imbalance, and break people free from the contracts. And so he started to get a name for himself. He'd come from New York, where he mostly represented, writers,
Yeah.
to Hollywood, where he became like the go-to for music artists, and he started breaking contracts left and right. And But then he saw Tom's case, and Tom's case became the big one. Um, and how did that lawsuit happen? Well, the CBS had stopped Tom's royalties. Um, and there was kind of a period where things were sort of Tom was kind of like slow walking things and trying to decide what to do. And he eventually consults with Don Engel. And this is when, Don Engel tries to play hardball with CBS. They had a couple of meetings. The last one did not go well. According to everybody's accounts of this meeting, Tom and Don show up at Walter Yetnikoff's office. There were several other members from CBS there. And Don comes in with like a list of demands, like, hey, if we give you this album, you can't say that Tom's late on the next one. We want this, we want that, and so on. But that's not the way that Yetnikoff worked. Yetnikoff was not ready for them to make demands. He was ready for them to go with his plan. And that meeting lasted for about 5 minutes. Um, and then Yetnikoff told everybody to leave, and he said, forget it. I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. There was already a lawsuit filed at that point. So there was a lawsuit filed a month earlier. And that led to this moment where they were going to try to come together again, try to plan to settle, but that meeting went sideways and no settlement was forthcoming. So there was a $20 million lawsuit against Boston for failing to deliver this album.
So now, next up was the Rockman. I actually bought one of those in, I think it was 86 or 87.
Oh, no
I,
way.
I never had a Power Soap, but I did have a THD hot plate, which is the same type of thing. Now, the Rockman really took off, and this helped Tom financially while he wasn't getting those royalties. So, how successful was he with those?
Yeah, I mean it took off. I mean that was the thing is kind of that was also slowing Tom. You could say it was slowing Tom down in delivering the album, or you could say it's just was part of Tom's process, which was he liked to tinker, and it was easier. That part of his brain worked better. But he had all these gadgets that he built starting in the mid 70s, and then um, it turned out actually a lot of people liked the Boston sound. Surprise, surprise, and so he started selling them. So it was, yeah, the Power Soak and then the Rockman, and yeah, I mean you can start listing off rock albums from the 80s that made use of the
Mhm.
Rockman. It was just this little headphone, Walkman sized headphone amp, that you could just you no longer needed your big Marshall stack. You could just plug in a pair of headphones or plug it directly into um, your rack to record straight from a guitar. And yeah, I mean, and I mean the other thing about it was this is kind of the rise of like home, the home, uh, amateur players. So like people were able to afford their own electric guitars now, and so
Exactly.
people were, it wasn't just going to bands; it was going to enthusiasts. So I have a figure that they were making up to around $6 million a year at one point.
Yeah, this was a it was a product. It wasn't just geared toward the professional, but also tons of people just played at home with them. And matter of fact, you mentioned in the book one of my friends, Ellie Deaston on the cars, that he was just right down the street and went and got one in person.
Yeah.
Um, this is kind of funny. Then came the choice between going with David Geffen or Irving Azoff. Now, I have a small connection to Azoff, uh, very small.
Uh-huh.
When I worked for the Doobie Brothers, I was hired by Bruce Cohn, who had managed them from the beginning for almost 40 years up till 2015 or so. At that point, they hired Azoff, and then within 3 or 4 months, they let me go. And I was told that they decided to go with someone in the office. Uh, so it wasn't him personally, just the organization. But tell us a little about the battle for the signing rights.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned these big personalities. Well, those
Yeah.
are them. Yeah, Irving Azoff, who was longtime Eagles manager and was kind of a ferocious representative of artists, um, took a position at MCA. Yeah, at MCA Universal. And then David Geffen, who'd founded Geffen Records. And so when Tom and Don Ingle are working together to refusing to give the album to CBS, they start shopping it around. And, who do they go to? Well, they go to Azov, who's, they know is going to be, not going to be afraid to go up against Yetnikoff. Azov saw getting a big artist like Tom as like hanging a Picasso up and
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, we made it."
Yeah.
MCA was at the time like one of the bottom of the totem pole record companies. And Azov, when he came in, he like basically fired, some ridiculous number of their acts, like
Uh,
40 out of 45 acts.
yeah, I think it was a 41 out of 46 or something like that. It
Yeah.
was crazy.
Crazy, yeah. And so, he needed to fill up the roster again. Um, and so, yeah, this ends up, but being this incredible back and forth over about 3 months. As first Geffen says, "Oh yeah, I'll definitely take Tom. I'll definitely take Boston. But let me talk to Yetnikoff first, because it turns out he's actually pretty close to Yetnikoff. And so he's telling Don Ingle one thing while he's telling Yetnikoff another. And Yetnikoff says, no, you can't have Boston unless, you pay me the certain amount. And there's just like all this back and forth. And then Geffen says, yes, I'll sign the contract no matter what. We'll take him. Um, but he doesn't, he never signs on the dotted line. And then in the background, you have Azov who says, hey, just tell us what deal you gave Geffen and we'll sign the exact same deal and we'll deal with the fallout. We don't care. And eventually they sign up with Azov and with MCA. But it was kind of one of these hilarious moments when these three record heads are feuding.
After 8 years since Don't Look Back, Third Stage was released on September 24th, 1986, which was just a little over 2 months before my 21st birthday. And that was the first new Boston album that I ever purchased. That was big that summer. I really did like that record. It defied what some of the critics said that they were wondering whether the fans would come back or not, and they did. And not only did the album perform well, but the first two Boston albums ended up back in the top 20 again. Now, in the trial accusing Scholz of breaking his contract by giving Third Stage to MCA, shortly before deliberations were to start, he offered to settle. What happened then?
Yeah, I mean, so the album comes out, and at that point, basically Tom had already won the right to and MCA had already sort of won the right to release the album. But now the question is whether they need to pay CBS for breaking the contract. And it was what 86, another 5 years pass.
Yeah,
And there's things like this blast from the past. And Yetnikoff is still at the helm of the record label. Um, and uh, and there they are, things are not looking good for CBS, but at this point, there's no way Yetnikoff's going to budge. And Tom's lawyers go to CBS's lawyers and say, "Hey, if we are willing to settle. We're willing to settle for $2 million, but you have to contribute it to, save the whales." Tom was very, is a vegetarian. He's into animal rights and conservation, and and it was like a way for both sides to really save face. And but according to my sources, there was no way Yetnikoff was willing to settle, and he apparently said "fuck the whales." um, so the jury goes off, and Tom won across the board. So all of his back royalties were released.
there were so many lawsuits. I had no idea. I knew of maybe a couple of them, but I didn't know about a big amount. CBS versus Boston, band members suing Scholz, Scholz suing band members, just on and on. Roughly, how many lawsuits were filed when all was said and done?
I mean, well, all this, I mean, we're talking about from between like 1980 and 2009 or something, or
Yeah,
2013. I mean, I don't know, it's around a dozen or more
wow,
lawsuits. Yeah.
that's
State
crazy.
court, federal court, and so on. I mean, I think that Tom's experience with Paula Hearn really soured him to the industry. He became very protective, and you know, I guess once you've been sued once and you've sued other people, it just gets easier each time. I don't know. So, I mean, and it's easier to, I mean, yes, Tom is litigious, and he has beef with some people, and it's really tough to sort of sort out whether he could have settled some of these things,
Yeah.
whether everything had to go through the courts in that way. I don't know, but yeah, it's a tough one. Yeah.
This is just something about the book. The notes section of this book, phenomenal. Lots of people, they skip over the coda or the acknowledgments or the notes of a book. Now, people listening to this or watching this, if you do indeed read this book, and I urge you to do so, please read it all. There is more info in the notes section than you'll find in some entire books.
Thanks. Yeah, yeah. There's a few little, treasures I put in there, stuff that just didn't fit into the text itself. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's that's the constant struggle as an author is like, oh, I want to tell people everything I learned,
Right.
but then it's not as good of a read. So, but yeah, people like you, I'm glad you were rewarded by reading them.
Do you have another story for your next book in the pipeline yet, or
I'm working on something.
good?
It's not music related. But yeah, I think it'll be a fun one. So I am trying to sell a new book.
I'll definitely read it. Uh, if the opportunity at some point presented itself, would you consider another music related book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely open to any kind of story. So yeah, if you have any ideas or any of your listeners do, please send them my way.
Okay, will do. Now, how can people find both you and your Substack?
Yeah, so I'm just Brendan Borrell, at brendanborrell.com. And my Substack, I've got a Substack related to the book. It's just powersoak.substack.com.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great chatting with you, Terry. All right.
I'd like to thank Brendan Burrell for all his time today. Power Soak is available at Amazon or anywhere good books are sold. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, be sure to give me a 5-star review. Or if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. They really help the channel. Also, be sure to go to tbpcpodcast.com and click that PayPal button to donate. We'll see you next time.